I asked you to send in the worst philosophies and philosophical ideas that you had ever heard, so that I can react to them and, against all common sense, have a go at defending them. So, let's get started. First up, we have a comment from @LittleBrookFarmver, and their worst philosophical idea of all time is the Galileo Complex. If your ideas and beliefs are ridiculed, then they are more likely to be true. It's very difficult to talk someone out of this, since all negative feedback strengthens their beliefs. Right, so obviously it's pretty clear why this is an example of poor philosophy or poor reasoning. Clearly, if an idea is challenged, sometimes that means that the idea is straightforwardly wrong. This is kind of how you find out an idea is flawed, right? It encounters some critique, and it turns out that critique is valid and sound in argumentation, and as a result, the original idea is undermined. And in an ideal world, it would be abandoned by the believer. But of course, we're not in an ideal world, and that doesn't always happen. I think that we've all probably met someone who has a bit of a Galileo complex about things, right? They tend to view opposition as some confirmation of their original belief. But I think it's also important to note that this often fits into a much broader epistemic framework. And that epistemic framework usually accounts for some kind of organized opposition to their viewpoints. That sounds a little bit abstract, but conspiracy theories and conspiracists are a very good example of this, right? Since it is baked into the foundations of the theory that there is some grand power attempting to undermine it, this allows them to paint opposition to that theory as evidence of the grand power that's attempting to undermine it. It's sort of insidious in the sense that it incorporates critique as direct evidence of the truth of the original belief. And of course, this ignores the alternative hypothesis that the idea just doesn't have that much evidence for it, or that it is poorly argued for. However, if I was going to try to defend it, I'd probably note that there is some internal coherence to this, right? It's not that they are pulling the Galileo complex out of thin air. It's part of the overriding viewpoint that they have of the world, that there is this almost omnipotent creature that is trying to deceive them, right? So a kind of non-conspiracist example of this would be an almost extreme variant on Descartes' evil demon, right? Descartes' evil demon hypothesis raises the possibility that at any given moment, all of our reasoning processes and perceptions and any kind of belief-forming apparatus is being fooled by an evil demon who is intent on deceiving us. Now, if you stretch that one step further, you could say that the demon is not just trying to make us believe falsehoods, but the direct opposite of the truth. And this is often how conspiracists conceive of the grand establishment, right? They're not just trying to get you to believe false things, they're trying to get you to believe particular false things, and those false things are the direct opposite of the things that are true. And in that case, a rough heuristic for coming to true conclusions would actually be to believe whatever the opposite you're being told is. So if you take the entire conspiracist worldview as true, or some equivalent worldview that leads you to this same general epistemological structure, then to a certain extent, the Galileo complex does make sense, because opposition would in fact be positive evidence of the truth of whatever you are espousing. I think that the trouble is that, of course, this does posit that particular epistemic structure where there is this nigh on omnipotent force that is deliberately trying to get you to believe the opposite of a series of things. And I think that that's sort of broadly not going to be tenable, certainly as a totalizing belief system, right? You know, even if you think that there are powerful forces that are trying to get you to not believe certain things, they're surely not trying to get you to not believe everything, right? And as a result, the alternative hypothesis that you've just got things wrong initially would start to creep back in. I suppose another time where the Galileo complex might work, again, heuristically, is when it comes to values or what behavior you might want to support. For example, say you are a 17th century Puritan, and you just cannot stand the Catholic Church, right? You're just virulently anti-Catholic. In this case, since you think that all of your values are just inherently opposed to this one group, you might take as a heuristic that if that group puts something forward, you would at least instinctively disagree with it at first. Or alternatively, if you put out a proposition and it's challenged by this particular group, you might take that as loose confirmation that you're along the right lines. Of course, in reality, there often aren't these outright oppositional groups with nothing in common. Again, they tend to exist in the minds of people rather than out there in the world. And as a result, again, the Galileo Complex doesn't quite function. But I suppose, again, if you took this, I don't know, extreme anti-Catholicism or a conspiracist mindset as read, then I suppose if you really squint, you could find a justification for the Galileo Complex. I think that's about as far as I could steel man it or find plausible defenses for it. Also, just to clarify, I'm not anti-Catholic at all. I actually quite like Catholic theology. But I do think that this, again, 17th century Puritan opposition to Catholicism did at some points take on this kind of oppositional mindset that might then justify a Galileo complex. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider becoming one of my wonderful patrons for access to occasional exclusive content, including, most recently, my full interview with Alex O'Connor. Right, next we have a classic philosophical thesis from @IronicNation3553, and it simply reads, "He who smelt it, dealt it." So, he who smelt it, dealt it is an interesting theory from a game theoretic perspective, right? If you farted in a room, the optimal move for you to make at that point is to say that you have smelt the fart. And I think that this is broadly kind of quite a sound move, right? Originally, you think, right, I farted. Other people are going to heap social censure upon me for releasing this noxious gas into the general vicinity and disrupting public order. So what am I going to do? I have to dispel suspicion. How am I going to dispel suspicion? I'm going to be the person to raise the awareness of the crime to everyone else. Because they're basically thinking, well, if I'd farted, I wouldn't want anyone to draw attention to it at all. I would try and hide it. I'd hope that no one noticed. So they're confessing that they have smelt it. They're drawing attention to the crime. This must mean that they probably didn't fart. And then the farter will see that reasoning and think, right, okay, my optimal move then is to claim to have smelt the fart, and probably have smelt the fart, I suppose, if they truly have dealt it and then subsequently smelt it. So he who smelt it, dealt it is sort of the game theoretic counter response to this, right? It's saying that, well, I know that if somebody farts, the optimal move is going to be to claim to smell it first, because that's exactly what somebody would see a farter as not likely to do. So the fact that you have said that you've smelt it raises the likelihood that you are the person that has dealt it, because whereas a non-farter would not gain anything by raising the profile of the fart, they might say it if they've honestly smelt it, but it wouldn't gain them any kind of social prestige. The farter actually benefits their social standing by claiming to have smelt it, because it lowers the risk that they will be found out and thus censured. It also then raises the immediate possibility that they can accuse someone else, right? And the first name that's raised will probably have some extra suspicion thrown on them. So he who smelt it, dealt it is essentially intended to counter this move. It's saying, no, that's not the optimal move for you anymore, because far from alleviating suspicion, you saying that you've smelt it actually raises your profile and makes it more likely for other people to find you out and proclaim that, yes, you have dealt it. Of course, the ultimate problem with he who smelt it, dealt it is that once it becomes generally accepted knowledge that the farter also has access to, as they almost certainly will, it changes the rules of the game, right? Because then they're not likely to confess to have smelt it, and so that they won't get accused of dealing it. But then, of course, that means that declaring that you've smelt it is no longer the optimal move in this very weird fart-based game theory. And as a result, the actual rule then gets undermined, right? So you can imagine strategies in the game of farting as like people building increasingly elaborate strategies based on what they think that other people believe, right? So you start at ground level, and the initial assumption of the farter is somebody that has farted is unlikely to say that they have smelt it because they don't want to draw attention to the fart. And that allows them a leg up, so to speak. But then the non-farter camp say, well, we now know that's the optimal move. So we are going to say, no, it's actually suspicious to say that you've smelt it. But then the farter goes, right, well, now I know that it's going to increase suspicion to say that I've smelt it, so I will not say that I've smelt it. But then, of course, eventually, this non-farter camp is going to catch up. They're going to think, right, well, now I know that the farter knows that we think that he who smelt it, dealt it. And as a result, they're not going to confess to smelling it. So if somebody does confess to smelling it, that's actually going to lower their suspicion again. And a counter rule will be formed, which would be something like, he who refuses to confess to smell it may fall under greater suspicion. Or in other words, he who smelt it did not probably deal it. And then they get to hear, And then this person, again, is the farter is stuck behind on the kind of game theoretic strategy war. And then they say, okay, well, then now I'm going to have to confess to smelling again. So really, the trouble with a rule like he who smelt it dealt it is that it's fundamentally unstable because it relies on a static set of propositions within everyone's heads during the farting game theory scenario. And that's just not the case, because as soon as you popularize this rule, everyone's propositions are going to change, and as a result, the rule has to be inverted. But the rule is inherently unstable, because as soon as the inverse of the rule is accepted into the general common knowledge of the game theory scenario, then the rule will itself then have to be inverted again and go back to the original rule, and it's all very confusing. Basically, you can't axiomatically work out who's farted in a social group. And I suppose that's probably common sense upon reflection. Moving on. So next we have @SavageDabber1095, and their worst philosophy is saying, in your opinion, after a person makes any claim that doesn't use language which clearly indicates subjectivity is valid and productive to a discussion. So I think this is quite a lot of philosophers and philosophy students' pet peeve, is when two people will be debating, say, God or ethics or logic or epistemology, and one person would say like, oh, well, you know, man, it's just my opinion. And I think the reason that it rubs people up the wrong way is because your opinion can be wrong. Like my opinion quite often is wrong. So my opinion can definitely be wrong. There's this tendency to equate both philosophical matters and also just like matters more broadly. Like you see this crop up in scientific discourse and discourse around economics and stuff like that, where there is this assumption that there is no right answer. You know, underlying this, it's just my opinion, man response is like a profound relativism about the nature of truth that is basically untenable. But that would be the philosophical version of this. The philosophical version of it's just my opinion, or that's just your opinion, is there is no truth, everything is relative, and you live in your reality and I live in my reality, and never the twain shall meet and never the twain shall challenge one another. And there are certain sub-discourses where we kind of muddle along quite nicely with this. You know, a really good one is taste. If I like bacon sandwiches and someone else doesn't like bacon sandwiches, or like my classic example is ketchup on toast, because I like ketchup on toast and everyone thinks that I'm a psycho for this, but I stand by it. It's very nice. In general, there is no arbitrating between different tastes. Each person just says, I like this, you don't like it, so what, man? Like, it's just your opinion, it's just my opinion. And I think that sort of works because we don't taste food for one another, if that makes sense. You have your taste buds, I have my taste buds, and genuinely, never the twain shall meet. We never have to experience one another's taste perceptions. This doesn't hold for quite a lot of areas of discourse. Ethics is a really good example. There was a recent article in The Guardian in the UK about assisted dying that effectively was talking about some upcoming legislation, and it said, if you don't think that assisted dying is right, you still have no grounds to challenge it being legal. And this struck me as quite spurious, right? Like I'm kind of not in principle opposed to assisted dying, but this particular argument is kind of nonsense in that if you apply that to any ethical issue, you very quickly get mired in this complete chaos. Imagine if we said, oh, well, you can be against murder, man, but like, don't impose that view on others. That's a bit paternalistic of you. I think that we would very quickly find ourselves in quite an unpleasant situation. The reason that I think that sometimes it makes sense is because generally we tend to put some actions in the moral realm and some actions in the non-moral realm, and we tend to view actions in the quote-unquote moral realm as subject to general public critique, and actions in the non-moral realm as broadly everyone's individual business. Again, taste is a good example. The other thing, of course, is that we can't find or see an objective standard for taste. And some people think that applies to morality. I mean, I'm a non-cognitivist about morality, so I kind of think that truth is a little bit besides the point. But if you are a total relativist about morality, then you truly do think that there is no arbitrating between moral tastes, right? Everyone has their own individual moral truth. And, maybe you can defend that. I think that moral relativism isn't that defensible. I think that it's contradictory. And I think that you can try and create more sort of sophisticated forms of it, but I think a lot of them ultimately do end up either not really resembling ethical inquiry or just tying themselves in knots attempting to resolve two things simultaneously being true at the same time while they're contradicting one another. I think that if you're going to deny moral objectivism, which I think there are actually very good reasons to do so, I think that you're probably better off reaching for a non-cognitivist angle or just error theory. I mean, if you want to go for error theory, go for error theory. I think that moral relativism is this sort of middle ground that I don't think quite satisfies either camp. And I think in practice, people that call themselves moral relativists will ultimately tend to be something like error theorists. You know, they're more saying there's no objective morality than saying everyone has their own subjective morality. Like, that's kind of a significantly less tenable idea. However, even if you could defend that in the ethical sphere, it becomes much more difficult with something like epistemology or philosophy of science or logic, because these plausibly have much more convergent ideas about what is true. And I think that saying it's just your opinion is sort of besides the point. Like, saying it's just your opinion is not wrong, right? You're allowed to have whatever opinions you want. I think that the reason that I think people find it frustrating is because it's often said as if it's relevant, when I don't think it often is. So yeah, I think the "it's just my opinion" response can work, provided that you are in a domain where there truly is no arbitrating between different opinions. If you're not in a domain like that, as I think most people view probably most forms of inquiry that aren't to do with aesthetics or taste, and even there are people that will argue for intersubjective or objective views of beauty. So I don't want to throw that out too quickly. I'm not that well read on aesthetics. So, just disregard what I say on aesthetics. Forget I ever said that. But most forms of inquiry, you're going to find it difficult to maintain this sort of extreme relativist position where "it's just my opinion" is not only true, but also relevant to the conclusion of the inquiry. Because in some sense, if "it's just my opinion" is a way of definitively ending an inquiry, there sort of was no point having the inquiry in the first place. You already have access to your opinion. You don't need to learn anything new. If your opinion is an arbitrator of truth in a situation, there's no point having the discourse. It turns the entire subject into something quite solipsistic. But enough with that particular ramble. Let's talk about something else. Right, next up we have an absolute classic from Boris Stanisik, 9252, which is just the proposition X is natural, therefore X is morally good. So, of course, this is a classic statement of the naturalistic fallacy, which was pointed out by David Hume, which again is just attempting to infer an ought from an is, or a moral truth from a simple description of the world. You can see how this is a fallacy, right? Just because things occur in nature doesn't mean that they ought to occur. This is often best illustrated with an example, right? Like, dying of tuberculosis is pretty natural, and antibiotics are pretty unnatural in as much as we've made them. But that doesn't mean that we should go back to people dying of TB, even more so than they do now, I suppose, and eschewing antibiotics. In some ways, this is the quintessential example of bad philosophy. It's often used in philosophy classrooms, both at secondary school level and at undergraduate level, in order to illustrate what poor reasoning can look like. However, it is worth noting that a lot of ancient schools of philosophy, such as the Stoics or the Cynics, or to a certain extent Aristotle, did base their morality on some idea of naturalness or the natural world. Later on, you have Catholic natural law theory put forward by St. Thomas Aquinas, which also, in some sense, claims to ground morality in nature. And these people weren't idiots. So what exactly is going on here? Well, essentially, despite appearances, they're actually using the word natural in a really different way than we probably use it today. Our concept of the natural and the natural world is purely descriptive, right? It's just composed of is statements like, there's a tree, or F equals MA, and all that kind of thing, right? When we describe the natural world, we describe it in what I would call a very thin sense. This isn't the way that ancient thinkers and medieval thinkers viewed the natural world. They viewed it as imbued with a telos, or a design or a purpose, depending on how you want to translate that Greek term, telos. So someone like St. Thomas Aquinas didn't just see the world as a collection of facts. He also saw it as a way to infer things about the mind of God. That's sort of the foundation for his idea of natural theology. Not that he came up with that. He's just one of the absolute pioneers of it. So much so that his name is just impossibly closely associated with natural theology today. But of course, this is a very different conception of nature. It is teleological, or I just call it thick. I tend to call it a thick conception of nature, again, to separate it from the thin conception of nature, and also to recognize that you don't technically need teleology for it to function. It's just that teleology is the traditional way that people have arrived at this thick conception of nature. The Stoics are another extremely good example of this. They viewed human nature and nature in general as ideally conforming to a universal reason that sort of governed reality, to simplify things incredibly. And as a result, they thought that aligning yourself with this universal reason, which was to a certain extent synonymous with a kind of nature, would be a good thing to do. That's how they infer a certain kind of morality from facts about the natural world. But if you look closely, this actually isn't inferring an ought from an is. This is already having the natural world imbued with an inherent ought. So I would actually argue that these ancient and medieval thinkers weren't really committing the naturalistic fallacy because they weren't trying to bridge the is-ought gap. They were, in effect, using the word nature in a way that already had a certain moral strain contained within it. For example, they wouldn't say that just because something occurs in the natural world, that necessarily makes it good. It would also have to fulfill this universal reason or mind of God requirement. So yeah, that's probably the best way I could defend this X is natural, therefore X is good construction. You sort of have to retroactively make nature something that we tend not to view it as today in our new mechanistic, non-teleological way of viewing the world. But, there are certain thinkers that argue for a return to this Aristotelian teleological way of viewing reality. I mean, Thomistic philosophers are often arguing for this. Ed Fayes is a very good example. I think he said that abandoning the Aristotelian conception of the world was like the worst disaster in philosophy in the past 1,000 years, which I would respectfully disagree with him about, but nonetheless, it is a position that you can argue for, and it's far from a totally insensible one. So yeah, that's how I would defend the naturalistic fallacy. You sort of don't make it a fallacy at all by changing what you mean by naturalistic, which, I don't know, it's a bit of a cop-out, of course, because by the time that Hume is writing about the naturalistic fallacy, nature does have this far more thin conception, because to a certain extent that comes about during the Enlightenment, when this more mechanistic view of the world is coming to pass. But again, it helps contextualize why thinkers in the ancient world and the medieval world did infer oughts from certain conceptions of the natural world. They weren't just being idiots. They had an underlying metaphysics that made the inference make a lot more sense. Next up, we have a comment from Arjun Pandey 3579, and their worst philosophy of all time is the principle of manifestation. You just wish that you get something, and then the universe will work its way to make sure that you get that object. Yeah, so obviously, this is a pretty untenable way of viewing the inner workings of the universe. I think that in some ways it's a sort of bastardization of, again, teleological ways of viewing the world, right? So if you're a religious person, right, if you're a Christian, for instance, you probably at some level think that divine providence is at work in the running of the world, and that as a result, in the broadest possible sense, everything will work out for the best, right? The end of the world will come, Christ will come to judge the quick and the dead, and things will go according to God's plan. And since God is the manifestation of all, well, not even the manifestation, the literal source of everything that is good and perfection itself, this is the universe trending in a morally positive direction, right? Even if things seem dark, there is eventually light at the end of the tunnel in the form of heaven and reconciliation with God. And to a certain extent, that's a much more sophisticated picture because it allows for things to be bad in the short to medium term. It's much harder to falsify than something like manifestation, where you wish for the universe to grant you a specific thing, and then the universe doesn't. And then you're kind of stuck wondering what's happened, right? You either abandon manifestation or you introduce some ad hoc hypothesis, like you didn't manifest hard enough. I think that this manifestation-esque philosophy is also pretty clear in some of the prosperity gospel style theology, right? Where if your faith is strong enough, you are meant to be granted material riches in this world, which I think, is pretty biblically dodgy. I'm sure that preachers of the prosperity gospel will have their theological justifications, but I've been working on a video about the prosperity gospel recently and contrasting it with perhaps what I think are more defensible theologies. And I really can't see the biblical case for the prosperity gospel. There are a few verses like, to those that have more will be given, and from those with little more will be taken, that kind of thing. But I don't think on the whole, even that verse can be used to justify a kind of prosperity gospel-esque theology that's in line with, the Gospels, I guess. But I think that the philosophy behind manifestation and the prosperity gospel is fascinating. And I do want to make a whole video on it at some point, so I won't go into too much detail here. I suppose if you do want to steelman manifestation as a thing, I think you have to sort of agentify the universe in a much more short to medium term way than you would in a, I don't know, sophisticated religious faith, I suppose. You sort of have to view the universe as an agent whose primary job it is to fulfill your wishes. In manifestation philosophy, the universe almost seems to be treated a bit like a vending machine. But then again, I'm sure that there are more sophisticated ways of sort of conceiving of this model, right? You can think of the universe as an underlying conscious principle of being and believe that it will provide in some much broader sense, which isn't quite so easily falsifiable. I think that to a certain extent, this is how most modern monotheists conceive of prayer, right? You don't think that prayer is requesting God to give you things and then God gives you them, like a kind of Amazon delivery, I suppose. It's more like you make an entreaty to God, and in his wisdom, he will arrange providence such that the problem will either be solved, or he decides that the problem is there to teach you a lesson, or he gives you the strength to resist it and the wisdom to overcome it and all that kind of stuff. So, I don't know. I suppose if you were going to make a philosophically defensible form of manifestation, it would be something like that. And I'm sure that the more sophisticated proponents of manifestation will say something like this as their kind of overriding metaphysics or overriding ontology. But in some ways, I think this also gets rid of what was distinctive about kind of manifestation-esque beliefs. It kind of was that they were a bit out there, right? You'd say rather than having these in-depth theological or philosophical frameworks, there was a much shorter window between request and the universe granting you something. I also suppose that you could view manifestation in a very metaphorical sense, right? You can say that manifesting something or requesting it in the universe is just a way of aligning your psychology towards that goal, right? Essentially, a fancy way of saying, I'm going to keep it in mind and I'm going to work towards it. I think this was beautifully satirized on the British TV show, The IT Crowd, where a billionaire talks about star space ordering. I can't remember exactly the phrase, but he says, he talks about his dream of getting a helicopter. And he says, right, I pictured a helicopter in my mind. And then I turned around 3 times and I threw the picture of a helicopter over my shoulder. And then the next day I went out and bought myself a helicopter. Sorry, that was an atrocious Matt Berry impression, but you get the picture. I suppose you could interpret manifestation that way, right? And say, no, it's not a mystical metaphysical principle, it's a psychological one. But in which case, do you need all of this metaphysicalizing language? Couldn't you just say that that this is what you're doing, right? You're holding something in mind. In some ways, holding something in mind is a much more straightforward, easy to communicate concept than the idea of manifesting something in the universe. Next, we have a comment by Bodhi Sayana, 2447. I'm sorry if I got that pronunciation completely wrong. But their worst philosophy is, if something is accepted by the majority, then it is objectively true. Of course, again, this is a really classic fallacy, right? It's the argumentum ad populum. If the majority of people believe something, or a large group of people believe something, then it must be true. Again, I suppose the nugget of insight here is that if you're saying the majority are wrong about something, you're effectively saying that over 50% of people have made a mistake in their thinking, and that they've all made the same mistake in their thinking. And that's sometimes true, right? It's not like that's never happened. In fact, it probably happens today all the time. I'm sure that I have loads of false beliefs that I've just inherited from my cultural context, or the fact that the majority of the people around me believe them. So I'm certainly not suggesting that you can hang very much on the opinions of the majority, but I suppose it does give you a certain amount of pause for thought, right? If I am disagreeing with the majority of people, especially the majority of experts on a given topic, that will often make me pause and reflect and think, I don't know, have I missed something here, or have they all missed something here? And it is usually the case that I've just missed something, right? But then again, I'm a bit of an idiot, so I wouldn't necessarily say that holds for everyone. If you were going to defend the full-blown argumentum ad populum version of this argument, I think you would have to define truth as something that is necessarily referenced to what the majority thinks. So let me think how you could do this. I suppose you could take a radically linguistic idea of the word true, where instead of truth referring to anything in the world, you instead make it simply a linguistic token and then say, well, the majority of people use this token true to refer to this statement like, the sky is green, therefore the sky is green must be true, because meanings in language are the result of the use of the majority of people, right? They are formed by consensus. I think that's a terrible argument, but if you wanted to make truth a matter of consensus, I suppose this is how you could do it. I do think there's a version of the argumentum ad populum which is both weaker and stronger, but is weirdly more defensible, in that if you say not that what the majority of people believe is true, but that what everyone, as in every single conscious being, cannot avoid believing is true, you still have to adopt an anti-realist position on truth, but at the very least, it becomes a bit more defensible, right? Because you don't explicitly get tied up in contradictions. Say we found that it was a necessary component of being conscious itself that you believe that other minds exist, right? That solipsism was false. In this case, I suppose you could argue that since truth is a concept that is crafted within the realm of minds, right? It's to do with the coherence and the correspondence of our statements to the world, at least with a classic correspondence definition of truth, which is in itself controversial. You could say that if it is unavoidable that every conscious being believes something, then it is true in this incredibly weird anti-realist version of truth. Or if you just take a pragmatist definition of truth, where truth is the end point of any honest inquiry into a topic, then if it is unavoidable that any conscious being believes something, then that would be true under this pragmatist definition. Of course, if every conscious being unavoidably believes something is true, then we would never know, in a sense, because we wouldn't even be able to question it, right? We would be inconceivable that it is false. And so, yeah, I guess that this would slot nicely into a definition of truth, maybe. Again, if you're already anti-realist inclined. But again, that's very different to the argumentum ad populum, right? Because you couldn't have a minority that disagreed with this truth, because everyone would, by necessity, be compelled to believe in it. But I think that is probably the only way that you could craft a philosophically sophisticated position around the majority opinion by virtue of its own majority. You'd have to have everyone agreeing, and you just have to have everyone agreeing by necessity of the construction of a conscious mind, such that no one and no thing could ever challenge it. And who knows, that might be true, because if it was, we'd never know, right? But that's not argumentum ad populum. So I've totally failed in defending this one, but I hope we all realize why this is ultimately bad philosophy. Right, those are the worst philosophies according to you. There'll be a few outtakes on Patreon, but I hope you enjoyed this video. Have a wonderful day, and please do stick around for the next one. I've got some very exciting videos planned for April, and I really think you'll enjoy them. But fantastic. See you soon.